The first time the Red Army saw the American tank, they laughed. It was the winter of 1943. Snow stretched endlessly across the steppe. Columns of Soviet armor, T-34s coated in ice, turrets blackened from smoke, moved east to west across the thawing mud. Among them rolled something unfamiliar. It was round, not angular. Taller, almost clumsy. Its gun looked small, its tracks narrow. And on its side, painted in white, the letters, USA. The Soviet tankers climbed down from their machines, walked around it, circled it like wolves inspecting an odd prey. One spat on the snow. Another tapped its armor with a wrench, thin, hollow. The sound echoed like disappointment. They called it MSHA, their way of saying M4 from its American name, the M4 Sherman, and they laughed. They had reason to. Compared to the T-34, the Soviet steel beast that had outlasted the panzers in the ruins of Stalingrad, the Sherman seemed like a toy. Its armor could barely take a hit from a German 75mm gun. Its cannon was weaker, its silhouette absurdly high. In a war where the first shot often meant the last breath, this tank looked like a coffin on tracks. Yet, months later, those same men would stop laughing. Because while their T-34s broke down in the mud, the Shermans kept moving. While Soviet mechanics searched for spare parts in the snow, the Shermans were already on the road again. And when the Red Army's supply trains slowed to a crawl, the Shermans rolled forward, unfazed, like machines that didn't understand exhaustion. It was not the tank that was remarkable. It was the idea behind it. By the time the Shermans reached the Soviet front, the war had entered its most brutal rhythm. The Red Army had clawed its way back from the edge of annihilation, driving west toward Kursk, toward Kiev, toward Berlin. But for every tank that advanced, two more broke down. For every victory, there were shortages of fuel, of parts, of time. The Soviet Union had the courage. What it lacked was endurance. That's what the Americans brought. Not glory, not perfection, but something quieter, something industrial, reliability. The Shermans arrived through a miracle of logistics called Lend-Lease. From the ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, convoys braved U-boat-infested seas. Steel hulls groaned under ice. Ships burned under German bombers. But still, they came, endlessly, carrying crates of food, medicine, trucks, aircraft, and hidden beneath tarps, tanks. Each Sherman was assembled not in secret laboratories, but in factories where workers punched out steel between cigarette breaks and shift whistles. Women, teenagers, immigrants, all building the same machine, again and again, thousands at a time. The Soviets, used to scarcity, could hardly comprehend such abundance. A Soviet officer later recalled his first impression. When I opened the engine hatch, I could not believe my eyes. Everything was labeled. Every wire, every valve, every bolt had a tag telling you what it was and how to remove it. It was like reading a book about your own tank. To him, it was a strange luxury in a world where survival often depended on improvisation. And yet, that was the essence of the Sherman. It wasn't meant to be perfect. It was meant to be built fast, fixed faster, and replaced faster still. That idea, the relentless, almost mechanical philosophy of production over perfection, was something the Soviet Union came to understand too late. Because wars are not always won by the strongest machine. Sometimes they're won by the one that simply never stops working. In the winter of 1943, the first Shermans painted with red stars rolled into battle beside the T-34s. The Soviet tankers still mocked them. They joked about the soft suspension, the narrow tracks, the gasoline coffin that burned too easily. But as the months passed, their laughter turned to silence. And in that silence, respect began to grow, grudging at first, then genuine. They began to call it by another name, the tank that always came back. It wasn't the hero of the front, it wasn't the legend sung in Soviet songs, but it was there, always there, rolling through mud, snow, and fire, carrying men who no longer laughed, because they finally understood. War is not won by what looks powerful. It is won by what endures. and the M4 Sherman endured. Before the Shermans arrived on Soviet soil, two worlds were already building their war machines on opposite philosophies, one born of desperation, the other of precision. To the Americans, war was an equation of production. To the Soviets, it was an act of survival. In the heart of Detroit, factories once filled with the rhythm of civilian life had transformed into an empire of noise. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant, built in less than a year, roared day and night. Sparks showered from the welding lines. Assembly belts moved with mathematical precision. Each Sherman took 5 days to complete. 5 days from empty floor to combat-ready steel. Men in denim jackets worked beside women in headscarves. They spoke of husbands in the Pacific, brothers in Italy. Their hands were cracked with oil, but their rhythm was relentless. The war to them was not across the ocean. It was right here, in the hiss of welding torches, the clang of steel plates, the ticking of time. Across the ocean, the Soviet factories told a different story. There was no rhythm, only endurance. At the Uralvagonzavod plant in Nizhny Tagil, workers lived beside their machines. They slept on concrete floors, ate from tin bowls, and built tanks while bombs fell hundreds of miles away. They did not count production in numbers. They counted it in survival. The T-34 was their masterpiece, brutal, efficient, built for a country on fire. Its armor was sloped to deflect shells. Its diesel engine could run on almost anything. It was simple enough that a village mechanic could fix it with a hammer. But as the war dragged on, the cracks began to show. Engines overheated. Transmissions jammed. Tracks wore out after weeks of fighting. Every victory came at the cost of machines that could barely crawl home. The Soviets needed quantity, but their factories, relocated east of the Urals and starved of materials, could not keep pace. And that is when the Americans arrived, not with speeches, but with ships, a simple phrase hiding a colossal promise. In March 1941, before the United States had even entered the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an act that would change the fate of nations. America would not fight yet, but it would feed, fuel, and arm those who did. To Britain came food, planes, and trucks. To China came weapons and fuel, and to the Soviet Union, a reluctant ally, came life itself. The first Arctic convoys left Iceland and Scotland under gray skies. Each ship carried more than cargo. They carried the thin thread connecting two ideologies that distrusted each other, yet needed each other to survive. The Germans knew it too. Wolf packs of U-boats prowled the North Atlantic. Their torpedoes struck with cold precision. Convoys burned under the northern lights, red and orange reflected on the black ice of the Arctic. Crews froze at their guns, surrounded by silence, by endless white, by death. Yet still the ships came, again and again. By 1943, the Soviet Union had received over 4,000 Sherman tanks through Lend-Lease. They arrived coated in salt, wrapped in grease, with instruction manuals written in English. Soviet officers opened the crates, looked inside, and frowned. Too tall, too light, too foreign. They didn't know yet that they were looking at the machine that embodied America itself. Not elegant, not revolutionary, but unstoppable through sheer persistence. The contrast between the two nations' designs was not merely technical, it was cultural. The Soviets built tanks to survive the battlefield. The Americans built tanks to survive the war. Every Sherman carried the mark of an industrial system built on standardization. Every bolt was identical to every other bolt. Every engine could be swapped with another. In the Soviet Union, that idea felt like a luxury from another planet. But as German forces advanced again in 1943, pressing toward Kursk, the Red Army began to see what this foreign design could do. A Soviet tanker named Alexei Smirnov later recalled, "We thought it was a clown tank, until we drove it. The engine started in the cold without fire or prayer. The gun sight was clear. The radio worked every time. We began to realize this was not a machine for heroes. This was a machine for survivors." It was a revelation. While the T-34 inspired courage, the Sherman offered certainty. And in a war where chaos ruled, certainty was more precious than armor. By mid-1943, Soviet tank brigades began to integrate entire battalions of Shermans. To the west, they were just another export. To the east, they were a symbol, not of ideology, but of endurance. Because beneath the laughter and suspicion, the Red Army was learning something that would quietly shape its future. Wars are not sustained by steel alone. They are sustained by the invisible arteries of logistics, by the hands that refuel, repair, and replace. The Sherman was not the hero of the battlefield. It was the quiet worker of the endless road, the tank that never stopped moving, even when men did. The man who first commanded the Sherman under the Red Star was not a famous general. He was a captain, young, exhausted, and still carrying the smell of diesel on his coat. His name was Captain Nikolai Polikarpov, a veteran tanker of the 1st Guards Mechanized Brigade. He had fought at Stalingrad, where his first T-34 had burned in the ruins of a tractor factory. He had crawled out of that inferno with his face blackened, his lungs filled with smoke, and a simple conviction in his heart. A tank is only as strong as the man who believes in it. When the American machines arrived, Polikarpov didn't laugh like the others. He watched. He had seen too much to laugh at anything. It was early spring, 1943. The ground around Kursk was still hard, the air filled with the metallic scent of thawing snow and gasoline. The Sherman tanks stood in rows outside Belgorod, their olive paint dulled by frost, engines humming in low rhythm, American grease mixed with Russian mud, a strange union born not of trust, but of necessity. Polikarpov walked slowly down the line, his gloved hand brushing against the armor. He noted the details, the smooth gears, the clear optics, the radios with English dials. He couldn't read the labels, but he understood the language of craftsmanship. Beside him, his mechanic, Sergeant Voronin, muttered, "Comrade Captain, this tank is too polite for war." Polikarpov smiled faintly. "Let's see if it can kill politely." For the men of the 1st Guards, the Sherman was a curiosity, almost a guest. They had been assigned a mixed company, half T-34s, half M4A2 Shermans, equipped with diesel engines modified for the Soviet fuel supply. Training was brief. The manuals were in English. The translators were scarce, so they learned by touch, pressing buttons, testing levers, mapping systems in their notebooks. The first revelation came from the radio. Unlike the Soviet sets, which often failed after a few minutes of static, the American radios worked flawlessly. For the first time, a Soviet tank unit could coordinate with precision. "Like talking between ghosts," one gunner said, amazed. Then came the optics. The Shermans had a gyro stabilizer, primitive, fragile, but enough to allow a gunner to fire while moving. Polikarpov's crew tested it on an open field. The shell struck an old tractor dead center. The men looked at one another, half shocked, half impressed. Still, skepticism lingered. The armor was thinner. The gun was smaller. The tank seemed built for another kind of war, one of open roads, not mud and fire. And then came the first battle. It was July 1943, the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history. More than 6,000 tanks converged across the steppe. The German Tigers and Panthers, new, massive, with guns that could pierce steel at 2 kilometers, moved forward like predators. The air trembled with artillery. The earth turned to dust. Polikarpov's unit was positioned near Prokhorovka, in reserve, their Shermans waiting behind the main Soviet lines. From a ridge, he watched the horizon burn. He saw T-34s charging, dozens of them, their silhouettes vanishing in fire and smoke. The radio crackled with voices, frantic, brief, final. Left flank collapsing. Tiger sighted. "Engine out! We're hit!" Then silence. Polikarpov's commander ordered them forward. The Shermans moved into battle, slower than the T-34s, but steadier. Their engines roared like an orchestra of diesel thunder. Inside Polikarpov's tank, the air was thick with the smell of cordite and sweat. The gunner, Private Stepanov, adjusted the sight. Through the periscope, he saw the shadow of a German Panzer IV crossing the field. "Target ahead! Range 800! Fire!" The shell struck. Smoke erupted from the Panzer's engine deck. The crew cheered. Not loudly, just a breath, a flicker of life. Then came the reply. A Tiger turned its turret toward them. "Reverse!" Polikarpov shouted. The Sherman backed into a ditch, mud splattering across the hull. The Tiger's shell hit where they had been seconds before. A flash, a thunderclap, a hole where the earth used to be. They survived, not because of armor, but because of speed and communication. Two other Shermans flanked the Tiger, their radios alive with chatter. Together they fired. One shot hit the track, the other the rear. The Tiger stopped moving. It wasn't destroyed, but it was enough. That night, the battlefield glowed under distant fires. The Soviet crews gathered near their tanks, sharing cigarettes, staring at the wrecks scattered across the field. The T-34s had fought bravely, but many never returned. The Shermans had fought steadily, and most were still there. Polikarpov sat on the hull of his tank, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. He didn't smile. He simply said quietly, "It's not the strongest tank, but it gets us home." And for the first time, his men nodded without laughter, because that night they understood. In this war, survival was victory. The following months turned the steppe into a furnace. Kursk had broken the back of the German offensive, but the war was far from over. The Red Army was no longer fighting for survival. It was learning how to advance, and with every kilometer gained, the Shermans followed. By late 1943, the Soviet front was a living, moving organism. Thousands of tanks, trucks, and men pushing westward through the endless mud of Ukraine. The T-34s led the assaults, cutting paths through German defenses. Behind them came the Shermans, steadier, slower, but carrying something far more vital than firepower: reliability. They became the backbone of logistics, the trusted haulers of ammunition, the steady guardians of retreating units, and the unspoken bridge between the Soviet front lines and the supplies that sustained them. The Red Army's supply columns stretched for miles. Rail cars from the Urals, trucks from Studebaker factories in the U.S., and Shermans packed with extra fuel barrels strapped to their hulls. This was no longer the desperate chaos of 1941. This was a machine, massive, organized, and unstoppable. Captain Polikarpov's unit, the 1st Guards Mechanized Brigade, was now a hardened veteran formation. Their Shermans bore scars of battle, bullet dents, scorch marks, welded patches. Each tank had a name, painted in Cyrillic across its turret. Polikarpov's read "faithful," a simple word for a complex truth. Faithful to its crew, to its promise, to survival. Their next test came in early 1944, during the Korsun Pocket, the Soviet encirclement of German forces west of the Dnieper River. It was winter. The roads were rivers of ice. The cold cut through everything: fuel, metal, men. But where the T-34s struggled to start, the Shermans roared to life. Their American diesel engines, fitted with proper preheaters, turned over even at 30 degrees C. The men began to call them MK, a term of affection, from M4, their model number. When the tanks lined up at dawn, their engines sent out a low, synchronized hum, a sound that told the Red Army one simple thing: we are ready to move. During one of those freezing mornings, Polikarpov's radio crackled with an urgent call. A Soviet infantry battalion was trapped on the western bank of a frozen stream, pinned down by German machine guns. Without waiting for orders, Polikarpov gathered his platoon, 4 Shermans, and rolled forward. The snow exploded around them as shells struck the ice. Machine gun fire ricocheted off the armor like sparks off iron. Polikarpov's gunner, Stepanov, spotted the German bunker. "Range 600, on my mark." The first shell missed, kicking up snow. The second tore through the bunker wall. The third silenced the guns. The infantry rose from the ditches and advanced, cheering, shouting, alive again. When the shooting stopped, one of the soldiers ran up to Polikarpov's tank and saluted. "We thought you'd frozen, Comrade Captain." Polikarpov just replied, "No, we're Americans today." The men laughed, not out of mockery, but gratitude. It was a strange thing in the middle of a Soviet winter to find warmth in a foreign machine. By 1944, the Shermans had become more than tools. They were symbols of a strange partnership that existed only on the battlefield. Practical, silent, essential. In the Great Offensive toward Lvov, Soviet Sherman units spearheaded the counterattacks, outlasting German mechanized divisions by sheer mechanical endurance. When the T-34s ran dry, the Shermans towed them back. When bridges collapsed, the Shermans built makeshift crossings using their own hulls as anchors. American engineers had designed the M4 for ease of repair, and the Soviets, masters of improvisation, took that philosophy to heart. They welded new fenders from scrap, patched armor with tractor plates, and fueled engines with anything that would burn. If a machine can learn the habits of its operator, the Shermans slowly began to speak Russian. In April 1944, Polikarpov received new orders. His unit was to join the First Ukrainian Front, pushing westward through Poland toward the Vistula River. The journey was long. They crossed towns that no longer had names, only ruins. At night, the tanks parked in silence beneath leafless trees. The crews shared black bread and canned Spam, American rations mixed with Soviet resolve. War had made them brothers in necessity. By now, every man in Polikarpov's crew knew the sound of the engine like their own pulse. When it coughed, they felt it. When it purred, they trusted it. One night, as the tanks idled in a snowy field, Stepanov looked up at the stars and asked, "Captain, do you think the Americans know where these tanks ended up?" Polikarpov thought for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Maybe not. But I think they built them knowing we would." That winter, the Shermans carried the Red Army to the gates of Poland, and the war began to change shape. The Germans were retreating, but the cost of every kilometer was measured in steel and blood, and yet, for every tank that fell, another replaced it, shipped across oceans, carried by icebreakers, rebuilt in Soviet repair depots. The Lend-Lease convoys had turned into lifelines. They had not just given the Red Army machines, they had given it momentum. The men didn't call it strategy, they called it survival with wheels. By the summer of 1944, victory no longer felt like triumph. It felt like fatigue. The Red Army had crossed into Poland. Every village they entered was a ruin, every road a graveyard of machines, both German and Soviet. And in that wasteland, Captain Polikarpov's Sherman crew kept moving forward, mile by mile, life by life. Their tank, Faithful, was no longer new. Its olive paint had faded to a dull brown. The turret was scarred, its left track plate welded twice, its radio patched with wire from a field telephone. The men inside were older than their years. Stepanov, the gunner, had stopped writing home. Voronin, the mechanic, carried a photograph of his wife that he never looked at. Polikarpov himself had begun to speak less, command more, and think only in distances. How far to fuel? How far to Berlin? How far to the end? The summer offensive was brutal. German resistance stiffened around the Vistula River, where remnants of the Wehrmacht dug into every crossing, every bridge, every village corner. It was during one of those assaults, near a town called Sandomierz, that the war finally looked back at them. The first guards were ordered to take the high ground overlooking the river. It was a trap. German anti-tank guns hidden in the tree line, Panthers dug in hull down, waiting for the Soviets to advance. The morning began with thunder. By noon, the field was a furnace. Faithful led the second column. Mud splattered across the vision slit as Polikarpov's driver, a young recruit named Misha, pushed forward. "Faster!" Polikarpov shouted over the radio. "Keep formation!" The reply came through static. "Panthers, 12 o'clock." The first shell hit the lead T-34. The turret lifted clean off. Flames erupted, black smoke billowing into the sky. Polikarpov didn't hesitate. "Turn right, into the orchard." The Sherman swung hard, trees whipping against its sides. Stepanov adjusted his scope. There, 900 meters. Fire! The gun roared. The shell struck a German position, scattering men and timber. But the Panthers were moving now. 3 of them, their guns turning like slow, deliberate predators. Reverse! Reverse! Misha threw the tank into gear, but the track caught on a stump. The Sherman jolted. They were stuck. A shell whistled past, missing by meters. Another struck nearby, showering the tank with dirt. Track's jammed, Voronin yelled, his hands slick with oil. Can you fix it? Maybe. If they stop shooting. Polikarpov climbed halfway out of the hatch, scanning through his binoculars. The German tanks were advancing, calm, methodical, knowing they had the advantage. He grabbed the radio. Command, this is Polikarpov. We're hit but holding. Request artillery. A burst of static, then silence. In that frozen second, the world narrowed to sound. The rattle of machine gun fire. The hiss of coolant leaking. The ticking heartbeat of a tank that refused to die. Voronin was outside now, hammering at the track with a wrench. Stepanov kept firing, each shot a desperate attempt to buy seconds. Polikarpov knew the odds. He also knew something else. The tank had always brought them home. "Keep firing!" he shouted. "Don't stop!" Another shell exploded nearby, throwing mud against the hull. Voronin was knocked down. "Misha! Pull him in!" The young driver crawled out, dragging Voronin by the shoulders, just as a final blast ripped through the orchard. The world went white, light, sound, dust, silence. When Polikarpov woke, everything was quiet except for the groan of metal cooling in the air. The tank was on its side, smoke rising from the engine deck. Inside, Stepanov was slumped over the gun, motionless. Voronin lay on the floor, blood mixing with oil. Only Misha was still conscious, trembling, whispering something that Polikarpov couldn't hear. He crawled out through the turret hatch and stood, swaying, looking across the field. The battle was over. The Germans had withdrawn. Behind him, other Shermans were burning. Ahead, the Vistula shimmered in the distance, red with the reflection of fire. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. That night, the survivors regrouped in a bombed-out village. Polikarpov sat beside what was left of Faithful. He ran his hand over the cold metal, tracing the name painted years ago in faded white. He whispered, "You did it again, old friend. You brought us home." He stayed there until dawn. The next morning, new orders arrived. The brigade was being re-equipped. New Shermans, new crews, new faces. Polikarpov didn't ask where they came from. He just nodded, climbed into another tank, and turned the key. The engine started instantly. The same sound, the same smell, different men. By now, victory was visible on the horizon. But for Polikarpov, and for thousands like him, victory no longer meant an ending. It meant endurance, the terrible, endless duty to keep surviving long enough to see it. The Shermans had done their job. So had the men. And yet, as the Red Army prepared for its final push toward Berlin, a quiet truth hung in the air. Every kilometer gained was bought not with steel, but with memory, the kind that never fades, the kind that follows you home. Berlin was burning, but months before the final assault, the fire had already begun, not in the city, but in the hearts of those marching toward it. It was the winter of 1945. The snow on the Polish plains was black with soot. The war had entered its last, strangest chapter, the chapter where victory and exhaustion looked the same. For Captain Polikarpov and what remained of his Sherman crew, the road to Germany was not paved with glory, but with ghosts. Every mile forward was marked by wreckage. Frozen horses, twisted metal, burnt-out T-34s and Shermans lying side by side, their turrets facing west like silent monuments. The Red Army no longer advanced in formations. It rolled forward like a tide, uneven, unstoppable, indifferent to loss. And in that tide, the American-built Shermans, the Lend-Lease orphans, as the Russians called them, became symbols of something no one dared name aloud: dependence. They entered East Prussia under a sky that never brightened. The snow was gray. The trees were black. The people, German refugees mostly, watched them pass with eyes hollowed by fear. The Soviet tankers, hardened by years of blood and frost, didn't speak much anymore. They had seen too much to hate, too much to celebrate. But Polikarpov, he felt something heavier, a question that had followed him since Kursk. Why had this tank, this foreign machine, survived when so many superior ones had burned? He used to mock it. Now he cleaned it with reverence. Because somewhere between Stalingrad and Berlin, he understood. The Sherman was not built to be invincible. It was built to endure. The final offensive began in the pre-dawn hours of April 16th, 1945, the Battle of the Silo Heights. If hell had a rehearsal, it would sound like that morning. Thousands of guns opened fire in the dark, turning the horizon into a single sheet of flame. The air itself seemed to vibrate. Shermans rolled forward beside Soviet T-34s, their engines roaring in unison. The ground shook. Men shouted over the noise, but no one could hear. Polikarpov's tank, faithful too, crept through the smoke, its headlights dimmed. Misha, the same driver who had once been a terrified recruit, now moved with steady precision. Every jolt, every command, every shift of gear was instinct. Through the periscope, the world was a blur of gray and fire. The German lines held for 3 days. Every village, every hedgerow was a death trap. Anti-tank guns opened from basements. Panzerfausts fired from windows. The Sherman's armor was thin, and they all knew it. But it could still move. It could still fight. And so, they advanced. On the second night, a shell burst near the tank. Shrapnel tore through the side skirts. Smoke filled the cabin. "Fire control out," Stepanov shouted. Polikarpov didn't hesitate. He grabbed the manual crank and turned it himself, sweat and soot streaking his face. "Target the flash. 10 o'clock. The cannon fired. The recoil nearly threw him off balance. Through the haze, he saw the German gun emplacement explode. Men and debris flung into the darkness. The crew didn't cheer. They just kept moving. By dawn, the Soviets had broken through. The Silo Heights were burning, and the road to Berlin lay open. The next days were chaos, columns of tanks pushing through ruins, artillery following like thunder behind them. The Shermans, lighter and more mobile, became scouts and spearheads. They crossed rivers on makeshift bridges, crawled through streets where every building hid an ambush. At one intersection, they found a German Tiger II, abandoned, its crew gone. Voronin, the mechanic, circled it, shaking his head. "Armor like a fortress," he muttered. "But what good is a fortress if you can't move it?" Polikarpov smiled faintly. "And what good is victory if no one survives to see it?" It was a strange thing, Soviet men speaking American truths. By April 30th, Berlin was a city of ghosts. The Reichstag loomed like a wounded animal. Every street stank of smoke and cordite. Polikarpov's Sherman was among the first wave near the Spree River. They crossed under sniper fire, shells falling like rain. The bridge ahead was gone, blown apart, but the tankers didn't stop. They found a way across, using the wreckage of other tanks as stepping stones. The Sherman's engine screamed as it climbed over twisted steel. And then, silence. The radio crackled. "The Führer is dead. Berlin has fallen." No one spoke. The war, that had begun in panic and ended in exhaustion, was over. That night, Polikarpov stood beside his tank in the ruins of Berlin. The city burned around him, walls glowing red, sky orange, the air thick with ash and memory. He touched the side of the Sherman, feeling the cold steel under his palm. Somewhere deep inside, he knew. This machine, mocked and underestimated, had carried them through the worst storm in human history. Not because it was perfect, but because it could be repaired, driven again, brought back to life, just like the men who fought in it. The last thing he wrote in his field diary before heading home was simple. The tank was American. The courage inside was not. But without it, we would have never reached Berlin. He closed the notebook. The engines outside idled softly, like a lullaby for the dead. The gun stopped, but the sound didn't. Even after the last shot echoed over Berlin's ruins, a low hum seemed to remain. The sound of engines cooling, of hearts refusing to slow down. For men like Captain Polikarpov, the silence after victory was heavier than the noise of war. They had crossed half the world inside steel coffins. They had survived everything: frost, hunger, fire. And now, standing in the ashes of the Reich, they didn't know what to feel. Time buried the war, but it never quite buried its echo. The fields where tanks once thundered turned green again. The forests swallowed the craters. Children played where shells had fallen, their laughter washing over the bones of machines that once decided the fate of nations. Yet if you stood there, on certain nights when the wind was right, you could still hear it, a low, distant hum, like an engine turning somewhere beneath the earth. History would write its versions, clean, measured, simplified. Charts of production, numbers of tanks, tonnage of steel. The Sherman would be praised by some, dismissed by others. In the West, they called it the tank that won the war. In the East, they remembered it as the foreign workhorse, but both missed the truth that only those who wrote it ever knew. The Sherman was not a weapon. It was a promise that even in the darkest machinery of war, something could still hold together. Decades passed. Wars changed their faces. New tanks rolled across new continents. T-55s, Abrams, Leopards, monsters of composite armor and electronic sighting systems. But none of them carried the same silence as the Sherman, that humble, unassuming sound of persistence. Because what made the Sherman legendary wasn't what it destroyed, but what it endured. It was never about perfection. It was about getting there anyway. In the late 1990s, an old film reel surfaced in an archive in Smolensk. It showed a column of Shermans advancing through a ruined German village. One tank had words painted in chalk on its side. Od Volgi do Berlina, faithful to. From the Volga to Berlin, faithful to. The reel was silent, but you could almost feel the rhythm, the shudder of the engine, the movement of men who had not yet learned they would survive. At the end of the reel, the camera lingered for a moment on the commander's face. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't proud. He was just tired. In that way only the living can be after walking through death. No one identified him, but historians believe it was Polikarpov. The last image froze on his hand resting on the tank's armor, a gesture of quiet gratitude. When veterans met years later, few spoke about the machines. They spoke about warmth, about boots, about bread. But if the talk turned to tanks, someone would always mention the Sherman. They would say, "She wasn't the strongest, she wasn't the fastest, but she always started, she always brought you home." And then there would be silence, the kind that doesn't need words. Somewhere in Belarus, the restored Sherman still stands. The paint has faded. Moss grows between its tracks. But inside, on the driver's panel, the name Misha is still there. Every year, visitors leave small offerings, medals, photos, even children's drawings. Someone once placed a tiny toy tank beside the hatch, painted the same dull green. The note beneath it read, in a child's handwriting, "For the men who kept going." The Sherman story is not about nations or ideologies. It is about endurance through imperfection, a truth older than any war. Steel can rust, empires can fall, but the will to keep moving, that strange, stubborn heartbeat inside men and machines alike, that never fades. It lives in every soldier who pushes forward when the road ends, in every mechanic who finds a way to fix the unfixable, in every act of survival that defies logic, pride, or despair. That is the Sherman's legacy. Not victory, not glory, but the quiet human refusal to stop. At a museum in Kubinka, visitors pass a Sherman displayed between a Tiger and a T-34. Children press their faces to the glass. Most don't know its story. To them, it's just another tank. Small, plain, out of place. But if you listen carefully, you might notice the difference. The Tiger boasts. The T-34 endures. The Sherman hums softly, like a memory trying not to die. When the last of the wartime tankers were gone, their stories remained, in diaries, in letters, in the faint scratches on metal, and among them, one line appears again and again, written in different hands, in different years. She brought us home. That is all. No medals, no politics, just that. The simple truth of a machine that did what it was built to do, and the men who did the same. Now, when historians look back at the great machines of the 20th century, they debate horsepower, caliber, armor slope. But those who understand, really understand, know the truth lies not in the numbers, but in the silence between them. Because the real story of the Sherman is not about war, it's about survival. And survival, in all its flawed human glory, is the most powerful weapon ever built. Some lit cigarettes. Some stared at the ground. A few whispered prayers, not for triumph, but for those who would never come home. The Soviets celebrated in the streets of Berlin. Banners rose, soldiers danced, but behind the cheering, the tank crews remained by their machines. The Shermans that had carried them this far were lined up in rows, their guns silent, their tracks caked with European mud. The white star painted on each turret was half scratched away, the red Soviet insignia painted beside it. Two empires, two systems, one war, joined only by survival. To the West, they were Lend-Lease heroes. To the Soviets, they were temporary tools. But to the men who fought inside them, those tanks were neither American nor Russian. They were home. When the war ended, orders came from Moscow. All Lend-Lease equipment to be collected, disarmed, and returned or scrapped. For many, it felt like betrayal. The tanks that had dragged them from the Volga to Berlin, tanks they had repaired with their own hands, slept inside, nearly died inside, were to be melted down like refuse. At a depot outside Minsk, Polikarpov watched as workers cut into the hull of Faithful 2. The torch hissed. Sparks flew. Inside, the smell of burnt oil and metal filled the air. Voronin turned away. "Feels wrong," he muttered, like cutting open a friend. Polikarpov said nothing. He placed his hand on the cold armor one last time. "You did what no man could," he whispered. "You took us all the way." The torch finished its cut. The turret fell with a dull, final thud. The men were discharged one by one. Some went home to mothers who barely recognized them. Some found only ruins where their families had lived. And some, like Polikarpov, returned to quiet jobs, instructors, engineers, forgotten veterans of a victory too vast for remembrance. They didn't talk much about the war, and when they did, it was never about glory. It was about the nights in the forest, the smell of gasoline, the sound of engines in the dark. Years later, in 1965, Polikarpov visited a museum in Moscow. There, in one of the exhibition halls, stood an American-built M4A2 Sherman. Its paint was new, its tracks polished for display. The plaque beneath it read, "Lend-Lease tank, used by Soviet forces, 1943-1945. No mention of the battles it fought, no mention of the men who died inside it. Polikarpov stood there for a long time. He could almost hear the engine again, that soft, steady hum that had carried them across Europe. He smiled faintly, then said under his breath, "You were never just a tank." The world moved on. The alliance that once saved civilization collapsed into suspicion. Cold War lines were drawn, and the memory of those shared machines was buried beneath propaganda. To the Soviets, the Shermans became a footnote. To the Americans, they were tools of policy, not memory. But to history, and to those who lived it, they remained symbols of something larger. That sometimes the simplest machine can carry the heaviest burden. That endurance, not perfection, wins wars. Decades later, when an old Sherman was found rusting in a Belarusian forest, a local historian restored it. Inside, they found a name scratched into the driver's panel. Misha. No one knew who he was. No records, no medals. Just that name, carved by a hand that once believed he might not live to see morning. The historian left it there, untouched. He said, "It didn't belong to any army. It belonged to the men who wrote it." In the end, that was the legacy of the Sherman on the Eastern Front. It wasn't the strongest, or the fastest, or the most beautiful. It was the one that kept moving, no matter how broken, no matter how far, like the soldiers inside it, like the world itself, dragging forward through the wreckage toward something resembling peace. When Polikarpov died, his family found a note in his old uniform pocket. It was written on the back of an American ration label. "We mocked them once. Then we lived because of them." In war, you learn that strength is not in armor or guns, but in the will to keep moving. They buried him with a small piece of steel, a fragment from the Sherman's armor, dull with age but still whole. And when the earth covered the grave, the wind that moved through the birch trees sounded faintly like an engine turning over, steady, patient, alive.